Hello and welcome. My name is William Leon Rhein. This is the story of my time in the Pacific assigned to a combat infantry unit during World War II. Along with that story, you will learn about other aspects of my life, some with connections to my wartime experiences. I hope you will find this story interesting. Before the war, I developed an interest in photography. This interest led me to carry a camera and a supply of film with me to the war. I figured that if I survived the war, the photos would assist me in explaining what I saw to others who might be interested in knowing about my experiences. After the war, I correlated the photos with my wartime diary and annotated the photos with descriptions of the subject content. These photos and notes still exist and are a primary source for my story. The photos from my collection that are included here are marked with my initials, WLR. I should mention that taking photos in the 1940s was not as simple as it is in the modern digital age. There was a certain amount of knowledge and skill required to use a camera properly. There were different sizes of camera lenses for close and distant subjects, and lenses had to be manually focused, along with aperture adjustments for varying light conditions. For extreme low light conditions, there was flash equipment. The cameras of our era used 35mm film. The film was easily damaged by dampness and extreme heat conditions which were ever present in the islands of the Southwest Pacific where I served. Each roll of film contained 24 to 36 exposures. We sent our film to a developing lab to be converted into slides or prints. As you can imagine, film was not readily available to soldiers who were deployed in forward combat areas. The film supply I had was sent to me from family members in the States, and our mail was often delayed for extended periods. I'm sure you can appreciate that as a soldier in a combat unit, I didn't always have the luxury of photographing what I saw. Other times, when I was able to film, I had to be careful to avoid content that would alarm military censors. When I was in New Guinea and New Britain, I sent many rolls of film to Australia to be developed. Along with my photos, there are a number of other sources of information that have assisted me in the telling of my story. During the war, I wrote and received many letters. Of all that correspondence, only 6 of the letters, all written by me during my 2 years overseas, still exist. 2 of the letters were written from the island of New Britain in 1944, both dated in late summer. The other 4 existing letters were written from the island of Mindoro in the Philippines in the spring of 1945. Though there are only 6 letters remaining, the letters are windows into my activities and thoughts at the time and are included as important primary historical sources for my story. Local newspapers provided another important source of information for my story. During the war, in addition to carrying the news of the war, the newspapers were filled with articles about local servicemen and women. Fortunately for me, there were many articles that chronicle my activities before, during, and after the war. I have included some of the more noteworthy of these that support the telling of my story. The war took me to many different places in the Pacific. The places I went were unlike any I'd ever been before. The inhabitants of the places included many unusual people of vastly different culture than what I had known. They ranged from extremely primitive to highly developed. There was an almost infinite variety of birds and animals and plants forms to see. There were spectacular landscapes too. My camera enabled me to preserve some of what I saw. This is a picture taken of me in the years after the war. I'm standing in front of Let's Camera Shop that was located in Lemoyne, Pennsylvania. At this time, in the pre-digital era, shops like Let's were common in most communities. This is where people went to buy cameras, lenses, and film, and to have their film developed. As an avid photographer, I'm sure I was one of Let's' best customers. This photo is especially significant since photography was such an important part of my life. In the years after World War II, when I was able to reflect on my experiences as a soldier, I put many of my thoughts down on paper. I used this material to narrate presentations of my slides. Some of those narrations still exist and provided another primary source that was referenced in the telling of my story. Here's an extract from one of them, which I entitled, "Look to the West." Quote, "When I first thought of correlating my pictures, those that were taken while in the Pacific, I was somewhat reluctant, for my slides represent a hodgepodge that no other traveler during peacetime would record in a similar manner. Being with an infantry unit, I had to snap the shutter when and only when time permitted. This in itself can be confusing, for it eliminates much continuity that many times is desirable. If I might be allowed to tell the story in my own way, I'll rely chiefly on a day-to-day diary that I managed to keep. Perhaps the pictures may not be too clear, but I hope in a way they will portray an inkling of reality. If one has become fascinated with the behavior of living objects, both plant and animal, he will unconsciously develop a keen curiosity about strange people, animals, lands, and oceans. And the grand thing about this is that it has nothing to do with rank, sex, or where you came from. It's funny when you come to think of it, what fragments and bits of knowledge we take with us when, for the first time in our life, we go to a place like the South Seas or the Philippines. I suppose that those of us who were in the Pacific formulated our previous ideas about the islands from such books as Robinson Crusoe or from Tales by Robert Louis Stevenson. We read these as youngsters and dreamed of far isles of romance and earthly paradises, slightly diluted with cannibals. However, a very important viewpoint is lacking. Until you go ashore and actually walk through the jungles, you never realize that all impressions of plant and animal life have been left out in our previous reading. To the man who finds himself in the large islands of the Southwest Pacific and who is blessed with time and inclination to look beyond the outer fringes of the jungle, the plant and animal life will become more and more exciting." Unquote. On Monday, December 8, 1941, Mrs. Hoball of the Civic Club of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, wrote to me to confirm my telephone acceptance of the club's invitation to present a program of my wildlife films to their group. This was to occur at the Elks Home in Carlisle the following month on January 6, 1942. At that time, there was a zoo in Harrisburg situated in Wildwood Park. I had become friends with its curator, Richard Rauch. I asked Dick to accompany me to Carlisle to assist with my presentation. From a young age, I had a keen interest in nature. That interest had become intertwined with my interest in photography. I had learned to use the camera to capture the natural world. My photography soon expanded to include motion pictures. At some point, my photographic work caught the attention of the Eastman Kodak Company, and I was flattered when company representatives approached me to purchase some of my photos. As public interest in my photographs grew, I began to receive requests from various interested groups to show my photos and give talks on them. Mrs. Hoball's letter, dated the day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, involved one of those requests. Here are some segments of the film I presented to the Civic Club of Carlisle. You must forgive me for getting a little ahead of myself. Getting back to my story, nature photography was a hobby of mine. It was not my livelihood. I made my living as a dentist with my office located on Market Street in Harrisburg. I had grown up in Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania. I attended John Harris High School. At that time, there were 2 graduating classes per year from John Harris, one in January known as the mid-year class, and a second in June. I graduated in January of 1928 in the mid-year class. You will notice from what is written about me in the high school yearbook that my plan was to attend dental school at the University of Pennsylvania and become a dentist. However, during my communication with Penn representatives, I was advised that my prospects for acceptance at Penn in their dentistry program would be improved with some additional college-level course credits. As I considered where I would go for the additional credits, I arranged to take a seasonal job along with a friend, performing general labor at Mount Gretna, a small amusement park featuring a large swimming pool, pavilion, roller coaster, cottages, and restaurant, located on 60 acres, about 40 miles east of Harrisburg. There was also an east-west rail line that provided passenger service to the park. In addition to the amusement park, the grounds at Mount Gretna were used for a variety of functions, among them religious retreats and Pennsylvania National Guard training. As a side benefit, our train fare, weekday meals, and Sibley tent lodging were courtesy of our employer. With my plan for dental school temporarily on hold, in September of 1928, I entered Gettysburg College as a special, non-degree status freshman student. The objective of my studies at Gettysburg was preparation for entry into dental school at the University of Pennsylvania. I took 5 courses in both the fall and spring semesters. While at Gettysburg, I joined the Glee Club as a tenor. I also joined the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity and played banjo in a jazz band. Then, as I entered my sophomore year, the stock market crash of 1929 occurred, plunging the country into financial upheaval. Many families lost fortunes, and millions were thrust into unemployment, which lasted for many years. During the spring semester of 1930, I learned I had been accepted for entry into the Penn Dental School program, and upon completion of the semester, I withdrew from Gettysburg College. I entered the University of Pennsylvania in the fall of 1930. The school had begun as the Thomas W. Evans Museum and Dental Institute, and later became part of the Dental School of the University of Pennsylvania. In the spring of my 3rd year as a student, on March 4, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took office as the nation's 32nd president. In August of 1933, before my classes resumed in September, I traveled with my older brother and 2 sisters to the Chicago World's Fair. Little did I know at that time that 10 years later I would return to Chicago to a place called Camp Grant for my initial training in the Army. As an interesting side note, later that same year, on December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, repealing the 18th Amendment and putting an end to Prohibition, a period of 13 years and 10 months from January 17, 1920, during which time the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, but not its consumption, had been banned in the United States. In June of 1934, I graduated with a doctorate in dental surgery, following in the footsteps of my father Erastus and older brother Charles, to a career in dentistry. I also had several other relatives who were dentists in the Harrisburg area, among them an uncle and cousin. As I began my dental practice, I became involved with a local figure skating club. One of its members was Wilma Irene Dreher, who lived in New Cumberland, located just across the Susquehanna River from Harrisburg. Wilma was a music teacher in the Harrisburg schools. She had received her degree from Shippensburg State Teachers College. The skating club participated in some ice shows at the nearby Hershey Ice Arena. Our friendship progressed, and after a 9-month engagement, on October 15th of 1938, we were married. The photo in the center was taken of us as we emerged from the Trinity United Brethren Church in New Cumberland on our wedding day. After our wedding, Wilma gave up teaching full-time to assist me with the operation of the dental office. In the spring of 1939, this time as a married couple, Wilma and I participated in another ice show in Hershey. The following September, 1940, I demonstrated my improving golf skills by winning the golf tournament at the Colonial Country Club, where Wilma and I were members. 8 months later, in May of 1941, the week after my 31st birthday, I was invited to show my bird films and discuss my photography hobby at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Then, in August of 1941, a news article appeared in the Harrisburg Evening News about my successful efforts to film the pileated woodpecker in a secluded forest near State College in the spring of 1941. The excursion included a surprising encounter with an enormous black snake.
Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
I had been in dental practice for 7 years. I was involved in my photographic pursuits, and things were going quite well for Wilma and me. We were optimistic about our future. Then, on December 7th, 1941, the day before Mrs. Hoball of the Civic Club of Carlisle wrote me that letter, everything changed. The Japanese had attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands, a U.S. territory. The United States had been drawn into the war that began in Europe in September of 1939 and in 2 years spread across the globe. These photos of Wilma and me were taken prior to 1941, while I was still a civilian and the United States had not yet entered the war. The response of the American people to the Pearl Harbor attack and the President's address to Congress was overwhelming. Young men flooded military recruiting stations, and the buildup in manpower and materials that would be necessary to fight the war began. In addition to the large numbers of raw recruits that the military would train to be soldiers, the military also needed skilled individuals from the medical and dental profession to provide care for this fighting force. As I continued to treat patients in my dental office, enjoyed my life with Wilma, and pursued my photography hobby, I was anticipating being called for military service. The events of war quickly dominated all aspects of life. We eagerly consumed newspaper and radio reports of the war. On March 11, 1942, under orders from President Roosevelt, General Douglas MacArthur was evacuated from the Philippines to Australia, leaving behind the American and Filipino undersized and unsupported army contingent to face an overwhelming Japanese invading force. The decision to evacuate MacArthur was made out of concern for the propaganda value he would provide if captured by the Japanese. Upon his arrival in Australia, MacArthur vowed that he would return to liberate the Philippines. As I read his words printed in news accounts while I was still a civilian, I had no idea that I would be part of the general's campaign of liberation. The bad news from the Philippines continued. On April 10, 1942, 10,000 Americans and 66,000 Filipino prisoners were forced by the Japanese to begin a 10-day, 66-mile trek in searing heat that later became known as the Bataan Death March. Only 54,000 would survive to complete the march. Then some good news started to arrive. On April 18, 1942, 16 specially outfitted B-25 Mitchell bombers took off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet to strike military targets in Japan. Though this attack produced only minimal actual damage, it did a great deal to improve morale in the United States following our losses at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines. More good news arrived in the form of the strategic U.S. victory over the Japanese Navy in the Battle of the Coral Sea, May 4th to May 8th, 1942. The victory served as a block to the enemy move to take Port Moresby in southeast New Guinea, from which an invasion of Australia could have been launched. Then, in June, news came of the United States victory at the Battle of Midway, June 4th to 7th, 1942. In that battle, 4 Japanese carriers and 1 cruiser were sunk, and 292 of their aircraft were destroyed, while our losses were 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 145 aircraft. Following the naval battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, the United States landed Marines on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands on August 7, 1942, in an offensive to deny the Japanese the ability to establish a base of operations there. The battle continued for 6 months, ending on February 9, 1943, with the final evacuation of Japanese troops. During this time period, I was concerned, as were most Americans, about the Nazi and Japanese aggression. Our country rapidly shifted to a wartime industrial economy to produce the materials needed to support our military. The government also enacted a number of domestic policies to support its war efforts. The rollout of these policies began in early 1942 and continued throughout the war. The policies affected all citizens and included rationing of many materials and foods and conservation efforts. Civilian defense organizations were created to help prepare communities for possible enemy sabotage or direct attack to the homeland. At this time, the focus of my attention was not on the distant war, but rather on something much closer to home. I had recently made a discovery that was leading me into an exciting photographic adventure. Up to this point, I had been successful in photographing many of the native birds of Pennsylvania. However, one of the largest species had eluded me. This was the rare reclusive raven, a large black bird roughly twice the size of a crow, made famous in the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. This bird preferred wilderness areas, and its habitat was being threatened by the state's logging industry. As a consequence, there had been few reported sightings of the bird, and some wildlife officials even felt the bird was in danger of extinction. This knowledge sharpened my resolve to find the bird. As far back as 1936, Richard Rauch first suggested to me the idea of finding and photographing the bird. By 1941, we had begun actively searching wilderness areas of the state. We found many nests but no ravens, perplexing to us because ravens are known to return to established nests. Finally, in late March of 1942, with the help of some friends, a pair of soaring ravens were sighted, along with a nest 90 feet above the ground, in a hemlock tree in a remote area of central Pennsylvania. The discovery was in an area known to us as the Detweiler area in the southeastern part of Center County. Only a handful of my trusted associates, including Richard Rauch, Ray Kurtz, Walter Kohler, Earl Wright, William Craighead, Ira Laird, Fritz Hilton, and my father, E.R. Rhein, were aware of the location. We needed to keep the location secret to minimize human activity that may disturb the raven nesting behavior. When I received Mrs. Hoball's letter, dated December 8, 1941, we were still actively searching for the nesting ravens. The March discovery of the nest meant we needed to move quickly to be able to photograph the young birds and the associated feeding activity while they were still in the nest. Within 4 days of our initial discovery, we returned to the site with all necessary equipment to photograph the birds. During the first 2 weeks of April, I was able to obtain some excellent film footage of the ravens caring for their young and showing the development of the hatchlings in the nest. The first news article of our discovery of the ravens and of my successful filming activity appeared on the front page of the Evening News of Harrisburg on May 7, 1942. Interestingly enough, the Raven article appeared next to major headlines of the war. The film editing proved to be a time-consuming and tedious process and wasn't completed until late summer of 1942. On the evening of Saturday, September 26, 1942, I arranged a special showing of the Raven film to a select group of interested parties at the Wildwood Park Zoo. This resulted in some favorable newspaper publicity. As a result, I began to receive requests to show the film from various groups. Here are articles that appeared for 2 of my film showings, one at the Seiler School in November of 1942 and the other at the State Museum in April of 1943, both located in Harrisburg. Later, I was able to locate a second nest, this one on a rock cliff in the same general vicinity, and in the early spring of 1943. I was able to film those ravens. As a side note, years later, after the war, I was interviewed about my work filming the ravens by Harry Alleman on the WGAL Channel 8 Lancaster television program Call of the Outdoors. The program aired on April 2, 1966, and included large segments of my film footage. Here are short segments of both the tree and cliff nesting ravens. I mentioned there were a number of domestic policies such as rationing of food and gas that were put into effect during the war. There was also monthly mileage restrictions placed on non-essential driving. Persons could be cited if found to be in violation, and penalties could be imposed. As you can see from this news clip, in the early summer of 1943, I was the recipient of one of those citations. A few months earlier, I had been involved in a project filming bald eagles nesting on an island in the Susquehanna River south of Harrisburg. This required considerable driving and lugging cameras, tripods, and other equipment to the site. The distance to the island from Harrisburg was 60 miles. Unfortunately, I had exceeded my allotted monthly non-essential driving miles. Though I was focused on my dental practice and my photographic interests during 1942 and into August of 1943, I knew that it was only a matter of time before I would be swept up by the war effort. The Army needed dentists. In the summer of 1943, around the time I was cited for non-essential driving, I received a notice calling me for military service. When I passed my medical fitness examination, I was granted a few weeks to get my personal affairs in order, close up my dental office, and put my patients in contact with other local dentists who could continue their care until such time as I was able to return to resume my practice. Fortunately for me, my dad and older brother Charles were also dentists and were able to take over care for some of my patients. Before I entered the Army, I had one last commitment to fulfill. During the spring of 1943, as I mentioned earlier, I had been engaged in another photographic expedition, this one to Johnson Island in the Susquehanna River, to film bald eagles feeding their young high in the nest of a tree there. Because the location of the nest was on an island, the equipment would have to be transported by boats, adding a dimension of logistical complexity I had not dealt with previously. As I look back, I find it mildly ironic that this amphibious landing on Johnson Island was a small-scale prelude to what I would later experience with the Army in the Pacific. After many hours of editing, the film was finally ready to show to members of the Harrisburg Natural History Society. The showing took place at the State Museum on the evening of August 23, 1943. Here's an excerpt from that film.
I would like to introduce you to a gentleman who is a real professional ornithologist. And he took me to a small zoo, the Harrisburg Zoo, in a large park area, and it was run by Richard Rauch. He lived in a little home in the park at the Harrisburg Zoo. He had been a high school friend of my father's. He taught me how to rappel. He taught me how to climb cliffs, climb trees, use climbing irons. They had a meeting in his house once a month of other people who were interested in the out of doors. One of them was Dr. William Rhein, a dentist in Harrisburg. He was in his 30s. He was very well to do, and he had started to take color movies of birds. And this is in the mid to late 1930s.
Wow.
Bill Rhein became my mentor. My school principal allowed me to go with Dr. Rhein, and the first thing we did was go to Mount Johnson Island in the backwaters of the Susquehanna, formed by the Conowingo Dam. And there was a hilltop isolated from the shore some years ago, so it had never been timbered or logged. So there were virgin hardwoods on that, and a bald eagle nested on that. was 103 feet from the base of the tree to the bottom of the net. We put a pulley system. We had a blind. We pulled the blind up and attached it it was probably 30 feet from the nest. You could go into the blind and look down into the nest. So with the good graces of my principal in high school, I was in the 10th grade. And I went with Dr. Rhein because we had a pulley system that I could pull Bill up. The blind was tied firmly and braced, and I would pull Bill up, almost at dawn. And he would stay there till noon. As I was doing this with Bill and photographing birds with him, he happened to have a Cine Kodak Special 16 millimeter camera. And colored film had just come out a little before, but it was available. And he was taking movies of this. He took still pictures also, but he didn't show them very much. He was almost unknown to the ornithological world. Yet he was one of the finest photographers ever.
On August 30th, 1943, 7 days after the showing of my bald eagle film, I entered the U.S. Army on active duty as a dental surgeon. Here I am in 1943 as a new first lieutenant at the age of 33. I could only imagine what experiences of war awaited me. On December 8th, 1941, the day after the Pearl Harbor attack, There were a total of 2,905 active duty members of the Dental Corps, including regular and reserve officers. By the end of the war, over 18,000 dentists would see military service, with 7,103 of these seeing service overseas. I would be one of them. The dentists that the military needed had to meet physical standards for deployment to tactical combat units, which would be operating in the various harsh and dangerous field conditions of the theaters of war. This requirement eliminated some dentists who were not deemed physically fit enough for such assignments. In addition, the planners thought the ideal candidate would be dentists under the age of 38 who had several years' experience in professional practice. Following Pearl Harbor and continuing through 1943, before my entry into the service, the military experienced a period of rapid mobilization. During this surge period, the Army Dental Corps was confronted with a momentous challenge with large numbers of men entering the military ranks so quickly. Along with the sheer numbers, it was estimated that half of all inductees did not have routine dental care prior to their entry into the service. In fact, the dental care received by the average civilian in the decade preceding the war, the Depression years, had been anything but adequate. 1 in every 4 inductees required emergency dental treatment upon entry. Time was the biggest handicap for the Dental Corps, since the men had to be ready and trained quickly, in some cases in a matter of months. Therefore, the majority of newly inducted dentists, immediately following their own brief period of training, were urgently needed at the many military training sites, bases, and embarkation centers that were springing up across the country. Before I could be sent to join the other Army dentists, I would need to complete Medical Field Officer Basic Training. By the late summer of 1943, when I was entering the service, training for dental officers was conducted at various locations across the country. My training course, provided over a period of about 12 weeks, was conducted at the Medical Department Replacement Training Center located at Camp Grant in Chicago, Illinois. Fortunately for me, as a dental officer, Wilma was able to accompany me, with the Army providing austere living accommodations for us at the camp. I would characterize the training I received at Camp Grant as a mixture of formal and informal instruction, some of which was provided in an on-the-job fashion. The formal training was provided intermittently, while I was also working in the camp dental clinic. It included both general military subjects and special dental instruction. The basic military training included military courtesy, drill, individual defense and protection, and the duties of officers. The tactical training included logistical movements, operations, field exercises, and the functions of medical installations. A field component included field hygiene, sanitation, first aid, supply, military law, combat principles, field orders, and standing operating procedures. The dental training component centered on the duties of the Army Dental Corps. As a civilian, naturally I'd worked in the office setting of my dental practice. The Army had its own system of forms and record keeping, different from what I used in my civilian practice. Additionally, in the Army, dentists were taught to perform their duties in less than ideal conditions, which may be settings without proper structures, running water, or electricity. Our operating conditions could take the form of a canvas tent or an abandoned hut in a jungle clearing. The Army had developed special portable instrument kits and procedures for functioning in the conditions that may be encountered in the field. We became familiar with the contents and use of these kits. Also, my duties would go beyond those of pure dentistry, and during active combat, dentists were tasked with assisting surgeons with treatment of battle casualties in aid stations and portable surgical hospitals that were hastily set up near combat zones. During my time at Camp Grant, in the fall of 1943, I was able to take leave. Upon completion of my training, I received orders to Camp Adair, a military training facility located near Corvallis, Oregon. Wilma would be accompanying me on the cross-country trip to this new assignment. We departed after Thanksgiving. These are some photos from our trip west. During the war, military facilities sprung up all over the country. Several of these were located in Oregon. I was assigned to Camp Adair, a 56,000-acre infantry training site located in the Willamette Valley just north of Corvallis and straddling Highway 99. The population of this area ballooned with the arrival of the Army. The camp itself reached a population of near 40,000 at its height and could accommodate training for 2 Army divisions at a time. The camp included 1,800 buildings, mess halls, barracks, offices, churches, cinemas, stores, servicemen's clubs, post office, bank, hospital, and bakery, in addition to training grounds and artillery ranges. Most of the troops arrived at the camp by railroad, as seen in these Army archive photos. The camp itself was like a large city and had a huge impact on the local economy. 60,000 men from 4 infantry divisions trained at Camp Adair from 1942 to 1944. They were the 104th Timberwolf and the 91st Powder River. Both of these later fought in France, Belgium, and Germany. The 70th Trailblazer, which was sent to Italy and fought at Anzio, and the 96th Deadeye, which was sent to the Pacific, where it fought in the Leyte campaign. The training for these units included small arms, explosives, mortars, anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns, infantry and armored unit maneuvers, and spotter plane support of artillery. It rains a lot in Oregon, and the excessive rain and standing water caused the camp to be nicknamed Swamp Adair. Adding to this miserable damp weather, my memories of the winter of 1943 to 44 were of the severe, bitter cold. The first goal of the Army Dental Corps was to correct conditions that might cause a soldier to become a dental casualty. The priority for care was determined by a dental classification system. After the urgent work was taken care of, the next objective was to provide men destined for combat areas with as much routine care as possible. Because of the sheer numbers of service personnel involved, it is estimated that 80% of the men deployed to the South Pacific in 1942 and the first half of 1943 arrived there with unresolved dental problems. This situation steadily improved so that by late 1943, 85% were Class 4, meaning they needed no dental care upon their arrival. Camp Adair had 2 24-chair dental clinics and 1 14-chair clinic. The first step for every soldier was to receive a thorough oral exam, known as a dental survey, with the results recorded on Army Form 79. From there, required work was scheduled and completed on a priority basis with consideration not to interfere with the soldier's training schedule. The clinics, supported by the camp dental laboratories and hospital, were equipped to provide all necessary care, including x-rays, surgery, and prosthetics. While at Camp Adair, my primary duty was to provide dental treatment for the military personnel in units being trained in preparation for their deployment overseas. Also, dental and medical personnel participated in actual Army field maneuvers with their assigned units. These maneuvers involved marching with full packs to a location, then setting up and operating a field hospital with all its components, including processing simulated casualties over a period of multiple days. When I did get time off, Wilma and I got to see some of Oregon's natural beauty during a few weekend excursions. Here are views I shot of Mount Hood in northern Oregon and Salt Creek Falls, located in the center of the state, on weekend liberties. It is interesting to note that Camp Adair, as an active Army training facility, imposed a number of restrictions on camera use on the cantonment grounds. No photographs of troop maneuvers, troops in formation, or military vehicles, aircraft, and equipment were permitted. And all camera film had to be developed through the post exchange. Processing film off base was not allowed. This is one of the few photos that remain of Wilma and me from our stay there. Along with the restrictions on photographing, the Army imposed a policy among troops to keep silent on just about everything having to do with what they were doing at the camp. These policies were applied on a service-wide basis at all military facilities and for all service personnel across the country. Service personnel were to assume all information had value to the enemy, and anyone could be an enemy agent. As the months came and went, so did my time at Camp Adair. In early April of 1944, I received orders to report to Camp Stoneman in Pittsburg, California, a staging installation for troops bound to the San Francisco port of embarkation. After a short stay there, I would take a ferry ride down the San Joaquin River, across the North Bay, passing Alcatraz Island to the San Francisco Pier, where I would board the USS West Point. This ship would take me to a replacement depot in the Pacific theater of the war. From there, I would be assigned to a unit as the Army saw fit. The weeks leading up to my departure were an anxious time for Wilma and me. Wilma made arrangements to live with her parents in New Cumberland while I was overseas. She would also spend extended periods with my sister Isabel and her Army dentist husband, who was stationed at Brooke Army Medical Center located at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. We talked about the uncertainty of the future and the need to maintain a steady flow of correspondence while I was away. We both had many more questions than answers. Wilma was concerned I would not be able to provide her with details about my whereabouts and well-being because of the military censorship of my mail to her. We devised a secret code system that I could use when writing to her and my parents. It was a simple code that only we would know and that would give insights without interference from the censors. With our secret code system in place, I boarded a southbound train that would take me from Oregon to San Francisco. Though I did not know it at the time, I would be spending the next 2 years of my life overseas. I would not return to the States until the spring of 1946.